Okay, it looks like everything is live, and I am basically redoing a stream that I did a couple days ago because I had problems with the area right here where you can actually see what I'm doing. So hopefully I've gotten the cameras all fixed and everything and you can actually see. Now we're working on, there's a picture of the style of pendant that I'm doing over in the corner, and also you can see several of them that I have worked on recently and just finished. So, and as you can see from the different ones that I have, this can be done with all manner of different sizes of crystals. And the beads that I'm working with are anywhere from 2mm to 5mm. And this might get on my face a little bit, but let me see if I can bring a light over here so you can see this just a little bit better. So when I start these, the first thing you need is just any type of these small tourmaline crystals is what I usually work with. Quartz points work as well, Herkimers. So like this guy right here, I have a little Herkimer that you could do the same thing with. Any of these like small raw crystals. I assume you could also do it with a long skinny faceted stone. I just have never done this with a faceted stone, so feel free to experiment, but don't say I told you it would work. So when I start, when I'm wrapping, I have this little sword case that I got at a thrift store for like $1, and I take the wires that I'm going to be using or that I use a lot, I stick them on a dowel and just slap them on there so that I can keep the wires that I want to use right next to me and easily accessible. So working off of the spool, this is 22 gauge square wire, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to take my flush cutters and I'm going to snip the end of this wire, because half the time when I'm cutting things while working, I don't make sure that I get a nice flush cut on this end. I'm worried about the flush cut being on the pendant end. So just in order to start with a nice clean end, I'm going to go ahead and hit that. And then I'm going to take my round tipped pliers like this, and I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to start to create that curl from the top of the pendant. And this is not a fully closed curl. I'm going to leave it somewhat open, and usually you can see from the different pendants that I've done different sized curls with all of these, and I tend to try and keep it either about the same length as the crystal that I'm working with or a little bit shorter than it. You don't want it to be much longer than the crystal, or you're going to have an unbalanced pendant with a huge curl at the top and a very small crystal underneath it. So I'll go ahead and for this one I'm going to do this green tourmaline. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to check its size here just to give me an idea about where I want to end this curl and start the circle for the main body of my pendant. And I usually just kind of take my fingers and smooth this around to get the first part of my circle in a kind of round shape. It doesn't have to be perfect because we're about to clean it up in a second. You want to make sure that your crystal fits inside of that circle, and you can see you don't really want it to be flush up against the wires. You need a little bit of give and wiggle room right in here, because as we start adding more wires and the loops that are going to work as these prongs, it's going to get a little bit tighter. And if you're already right up against it, I've made this mistake before, once you get all the wires in there, your crystal's not going to fit. Now thankfully I have a ton of these, and if I do that I can go back and I can look for one that's smaller and fit it inside there instead. But if you don't have a bunch of them, you're going to end up with a pendant that you cannot fit your crystal in. So we've gone ahead and we've made our round area, and it's about the size that we want. But I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take a mandrel and I'm going to use it to just kind of slide this guy on here, straighten it out, make sure that I've got a nice starting circle. And in this case, it looks, the way that I'm showing it to you looks backwards, but the front of the pendant will actually be on this side so that my curl follows the direction that I tend to like curling in. You can actually do it in the other direction as well. That's just not the way that I normally do it. Once I've finished this part, I use about the length of my forearm in order to make one of these, and I know it's a terrible measurement, and it does quite often leave me with a little bit of extra wire, but I do need to cut the wire off, because one of the things that we're going to be doing as we're creating this pendant is taking this end and passing it through this hole right here. And if you don't have it cut off of the spool, you need to have a very small spool that will fit through here, and that's going to get harder and harder as we create more of the prongs. So if we place this down for a second and set the stone in it, the first thing we want to do is we want to get an idea of kind of how you want the stone to sit. You can set it horizontal, you can angle it to the left, you can angle it to the right. It's really your choice and aesthetic, although based on the picture, we're going to go ahead and we're going to angle it like this, just to give us as close to the picture as we can for this demo. And so I'm going to take this and I'm just kind of going to bring my wire around to where the bottom of this crystal would be. And I'm going to start my first prong right there, right in the middle of where that crystal is. And that's going to help me mark where I need to be in my loops around. So I'm going to pass this through the circle, and I'm going to create a nice little loop here that's going to put my square wire now around and behind the pendant. And you can kind of use your fingers. You want to make a nice round loop for that prong. If you're having problems rounding it out at all, you can just go ahead, take your round tipped pliers, slide them on there, make sure that you adjust this into a nice circle. So now you've got your wire coming around the back, and we're going to follow it around the back here to about straight across the circle. And you want to kind of make sure that you're trying to keep the wires as close to each other and as nice and cleanly round as possible, but they'll be a little bit messy. We clean that up later with half round. Once we're here, you want to kind of get that idea again. This prong is going to sit right about at the middle of the crystal. So you're going to look at it and you're going to say, all right, this is my prong in the middle of the crystal. This is where my prong is going to be in the top. So once you know that, you're going to go ahead and, staying on the same side, create a loop on the back, and that is going to be your back prong. And this is going to give you kind of an idea of about where your stone is going to sit. And in this case, if you look at it, my back prong is a little off to the side, a little bit too far over, not where I want it. So what you can do is you can actually grab this with your round pliers and kind of roll that loop forward to move it upward within the circle to exactly where you want it to be. And then check again, make sure that it's in the right place. And if you're still not happy with it, go ahead and just kind of roll that a little bit farther again until it's centered properly. And I'm going to continue following my circle around. Bring this wire through here. And we're going to, again, kind of pass it slowly. You want to create a nice loop where it comes through. And that is going to give you the second front prong. So you now have almost like a little filigree figure 8 going on right here. Let me see if I can move this closer to the camera where you have a better view of it. Coming along the front, I am going to bring a loop around. And then another one around and tucked through the entire circle. And that is going to create the top 2 prongs. There we go. For this one, I'm going to go ahead and use my rounded pliers because it's not rounding out very well. Once I get this around, I'm going to stop it right here in the back, right where this curl comes up off of the circle. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to bring it out backwards and then up. And this is going to create a small bail for the pendant. And we're going to loop it up and then back around to meet itself. And this part, this front part of that loop that we've just created is going to be one side of our figure 8 weave, and the other part is going to be our bail. So when you look at it from the front, you can see where we have our curl, and you can see how that figure 8 weave is going to run back and forth between those 2 wires. And once we've got that down, we're just going to go ahead, and I like, at this point you could technically create the pendant, but I like to bring it around one more time, usually from the back, and just go through and create one more loop or 2 more loops, just to give, if you look at the picture on the side, how it has those loops inside of the loops for a little bit more detail. I like to go ahead and bring those around and do that either by making a smaller loop inside of one of the loops or a larger loop just outside of it. So I usually make one more pass through just to create some decorative looping. In this case, I'm going to create one inside of this guy right here, slightly smaller. And if your forearm is about the same size as mine, you should be getting right to the end of your wire at this point. Like I said, I kind of did this a couple times and just gauged the average amount of wire that I use. And then once I bring it around the back here, I end it off by wrapping it around the bottom of this bail wire that we've created. So I'm going to go ahead and trim it with just a small amount with the flush cutter spacing so that this side is nice and flat. and I'm going to actually tuck it through that bale wire and bring it around. And then once I have a better idea of exactly how much, I'll flush cut it one more time and pinch this shut. So this right here is going to give us the base of our pendant with our back prongs and our front prongs. And now I am going to peel back our loops within the back and use my pliers to kind of press forward and create an angle on these. So that we can slide our tourmaline crystal in here where we want it to sit and use those different loops to hold it in place. And as you can see, sometimes the loops aren't in exactly the place that you want them to be, and you'll end up taking your pliers and kind of rolling them to where you want them, kind of adjusting exactly where that crystal is going to lie until you're happy with the angle that you're getting. You just want to make sure that as you're doing this, that your crystal is held in there nice and tight. And so once we have our crystal held into place, you want to go ahead and get yourself a strip of half round, and we're going to run that half round along these areas where we have just the messy piles of wire. So I'm going to come over here, and I'm using 22 gauge half round as well. I'm just going to cut a small strip of that. And once I'm happy, I'm actually, before I do this, going to move this tourmaline up just a tiny bit and round this guy out. And then I'm happy with that angle, so I'm going to pass my half round through here, and I'm just going to start passing it through repeatedly in order to wrap this. And as you do this, it's going to tighten your hold on the crystal as well, because it's going to pull those back loops and those front loops tighter together as it's tightening this mess of wires that has been created. And you just kind of want to, as you pass it through repeatedly, you're going to make sure that you keep those wires nice and next to each other. You don't want a bunch of gapping or anything. You can kind of take your time and keep the half round as close to itself as possible. And as you do this, half round has a really horrible tendency to try and turn on you. So you can see as I'm doing this, every 1 or 2 times that I push it through, I kind of take my fingers, I pinch it, and I pull it straight again to keep it from trying to curl on me. And you're going to do this all the way over to that loop on the other side. And any point where I need to, I will go in sometimes with pliers and just kind of push a wire tighter if it's not pulling down good, round it out so that I have a nice round section. And as you get closer to these areas, you'll find that it's a little bit harder to pull these tight. You might have to tighten it with your pliers a little bit more, and it's going to be a little bit harder to get in there between the crystal and those loops as you get close to the end. You're going to want to bring it up as close to those loops as you can just to clean this out. Once I've got that tightened, I like to attempt to end the wires towards the back inside of the pendant. So I'm going to trim this with just a little bit still sticking so that I can press that down and inside of the pendant to hide that end. And we're going to do the same thing over here. I'm going to take this, I'm going to bring it around one more time and end it towards the inside of the pendant if we can. And that's just going to make sure, it's a good practice, anything that you wire wrap. You want to make sure that you pay attention to where your ends are created and how you make them so that you don't leave anything that's going to catch and scratch. So you'll want to flush cut that as close as you can. And then you're going to go in and burnish down that end with the tip of your pliers. Just make sure it's nice and smooth. And that's going to wrap that bottom part. And we're going to do the same thing with the top part. But with the top part, one of the things that I like to do is I like to take a single wire and actually pull it forward and leave it out of the wrap. And you can see in the picture in the corner where I've done that. And I just think it accents it a little bit and leaves a nice shiny piece that runs through there after oxidation. So I'm going to pry this guy up for a second and I will press him back down after I've tightened everything together. And I'm just going to go back here because I'm not quite happy with how I ended that wire up here. I'm just going to tighten that down a little bit more. Sometimes you have to recheck them because after you get done wiggling all these things around, it moves around a little bit and it's not exactly how you want it. And by now you should be starting to get a nice good grab on your piece of tourmaline here. Should be able to kind of poke at it and it should not be moving around inside of the pendant much. So you want to make sure also that you're aware of where your piece is coming out because we're about to wrap this with the half round. So I'm going to grab one more piece of half round here and wrap the top of this. And once again, I'm going to start right over by one of those loops and wrap all the way around. The only difference on this side is that towards the middle we're going to have to jump from one side of that little bail wire that we left to the other. So I'm going to go ahead and run this through a few times until it's nice and tight up next to that bail. And you can see where I'm going between that one wire that I pried up and all of the rest of the wires, just because I want to leave that one wire as a little accent. And again, you don't have to. This one right here, I did not. It gives it a slightly different look, but the pendant is just as nice in the end if you prefer not to have that one wire running along this part. And as I come around, once I'm nice and tight up against that bail, I'm going to go ahead and actually kind of tuck around to the other side of it. And this is where you want to be really careful. My half round is getting all messed up. Straighten that out again. Don't forget to keep straightening out your half round. Once you get this right about here, this is where you want to be really careful, because this is also really where you're tying down where this curl comes off of your pendant. And that curl is a large part of the top part of your pendant, so you want to make sure that you don't accidentally tie it down too close or too small so that you don't have much left for your figure 8 weave. And as I said, the half round, it is curling on me, so I'm going to go ahead and bend this back into the right direction before I continue. And when you're having this problem, sometimes you just gotta slow down a little bit and really make sure that you move each wire of the half round through and straighten after each feed through, instead of trying to do 2 or 3 before straightening it. And you want to be careful, because like I just did, if you're holding on to the wrong part of the pendant while you're doing this and you're grabbing it too tight, you might smush the pendant slightly out of shape, and now I'm going to have to go back in once I'm done and readjust those shapes to make sure that it's a nice circle and not some sort of slightly smushed oblong shape from me grabbing onto it far too tight. And that's just because I'm fighting with this half round. And now as I'm getting closer to these loops over here, it's going to get a little bit harder to pull tight because they're slightly spread out from the loops being on either side of the tourmaline. So I'm going to have to start coming in here and helping roll that around with my pliers to tighten that up nice and good. And then I'm at the end, I'm going to go ahead and bring this around and finish it on the inside of the pendant. And then because I have not done it yet, I'm going to come over here and do the same thing on the other side. Just snip off this half round in the inside middle of the pendant on the other side as well, and burnish down that point with my pliers. And then I'm going to dismiss my alarm over there. And now I'm just going through with my fingers and kind of pressing this guy back into shape, because like I said, I definitely grabbed too hard when I was in there and kind of pressed some of these guys out of where I wanted them to be. So I'm going to go ahead and slide these guys back into a nice circle. And now you have the main base of your pendant at this point. You have the nice circle, you have your crystal held in here, and you can take your pliers and kind of adjust the angle at which your loops are sitting at this point to hold best against the tourmaline. And then we're going to take some weaving wire, we're going to clean up, and we're going to do this figure 8 up at the top. And along with that, and I'm working with 28 gauge weaving wire, along with doing the figure 8 at the top, one of the things that I find really cleans up a pendant and makes it look nice is if you go ahead and take that weaving wire when you've wrapped half round around something, and you go ahead and you follow that half round with this weaving wire. And we're going to go around and we're going to basically feed that weaving wire in the same direction that we were feeding the half round. And we're going to slide that into each of the little dips between the wires. And it's going to fill those wires in. It's going to give it a look closer to a coiled coil. And it just, in my opinion, you don't actually have to do this part for your pendants, but I find that it just gives it a cleaner, more finished look and a little bit more depth when you oxidize it. And you can see that in the bottom left-hand corner of the pendant that I have the picture of. And this is just a whole lot of feeding it through. And it gets a little monotonous, feeling like I just did this and I'm doing it all over again, but I just personally feel like in the end the result is worth the extra work. And as you're doing this, you just want to kind of make sure as you go that you're checking that you're hitting every single dip, because it will be obvious if you miss one. Especially after, if you plan to oxidize your pendant, you will be able to tell that there was a dip that did not get a piece of weaving wire in it. I'm just gonna finish this little area. We're coming up on the other side, and once we get to the sides, you're gonna take this weaving wire and we're going to tie it off. And because I've found that the smaller weaving wires do not do as good of a job tying off around a whole bunch of wires, they tend to poke out more, try to kind of escape. You want to wrap it around a single wire if you can find one. And what I usually use for that in this case is going to be that single loop that we've created on each side for the back prong holding the tourmaline. So I'm going to tighten this guy down. Since we're getting pretty close to the end, I'm just going to trim this guy a little bit shorter, move that out of the way. We're going to go ahead and get these last two loops. And then after that, I am going to wrap it multiple times around this wire right here. And that's going to be a little bit of a challenge sometimes to actually get in there. Sometimes I actually have to pull the prong away from the tourmaline to get around it and then push it back against the tourmaline once I'm done. So we're going to go ahead and wrap this around several times and just tighten that down so that it won't go anywhere, and so that we can kind of hide the end of this wire behind this one. And then I'm going to pinch that prong back down tight so that it's holding my tourmaline. And I'm going to do the same thing over here. This prong is a little bit further out and easier to access. So I'm able to, I think, I could be lying, yeah, I am able to get through this wire without having to pull it out and away from the stone at all. So I'm going to pass this through, and when I tie things off, I usually go 3 to 4 times at a minimum, sometimes a little bit more, but just enough that if there's ever a light tug or something that puts pressure on the wire, if you only wrap it around once or twice, sometimes that light tug on the wire will be enough to start it unraveling, and we don't want that. So you want to go around it at least 3 or 4 times. In this case I did 5 just because I was talking. And then the same with all the others. Flush cut it as close as you can, and then burnish that tip down flat to keep it where it belongs. And that's going to go ahead and clean up that bottom section, just make it look a little bit nicer. And now I'm going to do, right up here on the top, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do this figure 8 weave that's going to go between my bail and my little curl that I made. But before I do that, one of the important things that I take into account when creating pendants is the longevity of the pendant. And one of the very important parts of that, especially working if you're working in a soft metal like gold or something like that, it's very important to keep in mind that this single 22 gauge of square wire is not going to do well if they put it on a chain. That chain, if it's sliding back and forth, is going to slowly eat through your wire. So I'm going to take this small leftover piece of half round from before, and I'm just going to wrap it from the top here down to the bottom on this bail to give it a little bit of reinforcement here, being wrapped around by this 22 gauge, and it will allow it, if it's ever put on a chain or something, and I used to sell these on cords, and I did have some complaints that people had moved them to chains and it was eating through that single 22 gauge wire. So I did some repairs, and I found that it's just easier to go ahead and make sure, whenever you make a bail for anything, to just make sure that it's thick enough that it's going to be able to handle that. And in this case, it's putting a whole extra setting of 22 gauge around there that it has to work through before it ever gets to the central wire. So if it ever starts wearing this down, likely when I get it, the repair will be as simple as just replacing this 22 gauge. But I have a couple of these pendants that I've kept for myself, and I don't see nearly as much wear on the wire doing it this way, because with the half round like this, it's only putting the pressure of the chain on such a small point on the half round a lot of the time that it's not wearing through the entire wire at the same time like it does with the flat square wire. These parts where you're just feeding things through, I know they're not the most exciting to watch, so I try to explain my reasoning and stuff like that while I'm doing it, so that you're not just sitting here watching me count however many loops I create. I'm getting here towards the end. You can see it's getting a little bit hard to get the half round through each time. The wires work hardening a little bit, and it's not really playing friendly, so I'm gonna get these last 2 pieces through here. to finish off these loops, and I'm going to do it with my pliers. And then I'm going to go ahead and flush cut this guy and smooth him down on each side here. Here we go. I'm just going to smooth this guy down because we don't want any pointy parts sticking out. And if you want to move this closer to the camera so you can see that half round, I've brought it all the way around up here to the top, but I did not do this front part because the front part is where we are going to be connecting the figure 8 weave, so we need that to be just a bare wire. And this part up here, this top section, is really the part that you're the most worried about anyway, because that is where a chain or a cord is going to sit when holding that pendant. I'm going to go ahead and cut myself a little piece of weaving wire. And I'm going to start it down here at the bottom just by wrapping it around once or twice. And if you've never done, this is a weave that's done a lot for making bales and things like that. And I don't know why, I've always called it the figure 8 weave. I feel like some people call it the ladder weave. But you're going to go around 2 times on one side and then 2 times on the next side. And that's how you start this out. And you're going to kind of, as you go through, if you're coming off the top of one side, then you're going to go around the bottom of the other side as you switch. And when you do this, it can actually create a very tight weave. And I tend to, as you can see in the picture, like the way that it looks with a slightly looser weave. So what you do in that case, when I'm starting it out, I do 2 on one side, 2 on the next side. And then as I move up the pendant, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start adding more loops on each side. So instead of doing 2, I'm going to do 3 and then 3. And what this will do is it will spread out the distance between those wires that go back and forth so that you'll have more spacing and it'll look closer to the picture. And once I start doing this and adding more, a lot of times I will add, if I'm doing a full loop, I will add more on the long side than I do on the short side. So this wire is a lot shorter than this curl right here. So in order to make sure that I'm staying around the same part of the wire on each side, I may do 5 on the outside and only 3 on the inside. For this pendant, it's not as important because the figure 8 does not go all the way up and around the curve, but it's just something to keep in mind when doing this weave if you're doing it around swirls, that sometimes it helps to do less on the shorter side of the swirl. And you can see that starting to build our little figure 8 there, or our ladder, or whatever it is you've learned that weave as. Oh. Sometimes you start having an issue with the wire, and just like with the half rounds, you just want to take your fingers and kind of straighten it out there. I especially get really terrible ends on my wire here where I keep pinching it, grabbing it, yanking it. So I usually, with my weaving wire, try and leave myself an inch or two that I plan on cutting off at the end, just because I know otherwise I end up with really messy wire that even when you wrap it doesn't always look so good. And with this weave especially, because you have those parts that are running between the two wires, the straighter you can keep that wire as you're working with it, the cleaner those lines between are going to be. So if you take this and run it between these two wires, but with a kinked and messy wire, it's not going to be as nice and clean. I like to, you really can choose how far up you want to go with this. I like to go up far enough to kind of fill that wire on the inside until it's close and up against the half round that I wrapped. So I just kind of see how far up the curl it's going to go doing my 5 on one side, 5 on the other. And when I reach the top part where the half round is, that's just my signal to stop. But if you wanted to go further around, you could. If you wanted to go less around, you also could. Catching all my pliers down there. And this one is right about up there at this point. So this will probably be my last back and forth loop. And I also just realized that this went live on my personal profile and not my wire wrapping page. So looks like I'm still dealing with a few of my issues with getting everything working with the broadcasting software and all that. I apologize. I'll try and get this on my actual wire wrapping page next time for everybody who follows me there. But for those who missed this in live, I apologize. I'm going to go ahead and share this video over to my wire wrapping page. So at this point, I've gone ahead and I've created my figure 8 across here, and then I've tied it off in the last little bit of this central bail. So I'm going to trim that down. And the only thing missing right now, once we clean these wires off that were left over from where we started and ended the weave, is adding the beads. And the beads that I have are just little hollow beads, and they start at 2 and end at 5 millimeters. And I just have little bags of different sizes. And I like to create that kind of stepping stone effect with these, where you start with the smallest bead and you kind of build your way upward. I find that that really looks a lot nicer than just sticking a bunch of beads that are all the same size. But if you have stone beads or something along those lines that you would rather use, that can be done as well. And I start my beads just passing my wire wrapping through at the bottom of one of my prong loops. And then give myself enough wire to run from there up to my curl. And I want that on both sides. And then I'm just going to take my wire, pinch them together, twist the pendant a couple times to just create a little twist in that wire. Before you do this, make sure that you have beads with holes in them large enough to fit 2 of your weaving wire. If you don't, you'll have to tie your weaving wire off. But I prefer to have 2 wires through the inside, as I feel like it's a little bit more secure. And so now we're just going to start feeding these in. I started with 2 millimeter, moved up to 3, 4, 5. And once I get to the 5, I'm going to go ahead and lay it across the top of my pendant and see where it sits. So I'm going to lay it here and just kind of see how much distance there is between that bead and the curl. And then I want to fill that distance. In this case, it looks like I can probably fit a whole nother 5 millimeter bead in there. And then I'll lay it down again and see if I'm happy with the extra 5 millimeter, or if it's kind of pushing a little bit and I feel like it would be better to move that downward to a 4. And I think I'm happier going ahead and dropping that down to a 4. Since I have the 2 wires, I'm going to tie one of them around the front and one of them from the back to the front. And what that's going to do is it's going to allow me to draw these tight up against the pendant from both sides to keep them centered. So once I get those nice and tightened to that curl, I have several ways that I can finish this off. I can either go ahead and tie it off right here, which is what I am planning on doing in this instance, because it's nice and held centered where it is. Or in some instances, I will run the wires around the beads to help tie the beads down. And I've gone ahead and tied that bead wire down actually to the where the figure 8 is, and then in the back I'm going to tie it to the bottom of this bail, and that's going to hold these guys nice and tight against the pendant. And with multiple wires inside of them, it's going to be better at holding without those wires on the inside breaking. So that does one side for the beads, and now we're going to do the same thing on the other side. I'm going to start around where we have our tourmaline sitting, And then I'm going to pull that. Actually, it's a little bit too far. There we go. And again, I'm going to make sure that I have enough wire to run up and around, because for this side I actually run the beads a little bit up the bail. Then I'm going to twist those together, and I'm going to start adding my beads. And for these beads, because it is such a long distance compared to the other one, I plan on doubling up. So I just put two 2mm beads, and then I'll do the same with the 3mm instead of simply putting one of each, and that's going to allow me to push further along here since I have a further distance to go, while still giving me that nice clean graduation of bead sizes. And then as I get to the point where I'm up against the bail, I'm actually going to start dropping the size again. 3, 2, and then that will allow me to run slightly up the bail like I did on the pendant in the picture. So you can see our nice graduation of beads here, and it's going to lay up against this. You should have it come about to where your curl hits the bail, and one of these wires we're actually going to use to tie that curl to the bail. And I'm going to do that by passing it around the back here, tightening it down. And then bringing it several times around this curl to hold the curl down tight. You may have to slightly adjust how curled the curl is to get it to fit exactly where you want it to go. There we go. And then we're going to snip that and smooth it along to the back of the pendant so that it won't catch on anything. And then we're going to take the other side of this wire, and we are going to go through the figure 8 weave, and then we're actually going to wrap it between two of the beads and then further down through the figure 8 weave and pull it tight. And what we're doing here is we're just tightening these beads up against the bail so that they're going to stay where we want them and not wiggle around too much. Towards the bottom here, it can be a little bit hard to get that wire to come through where you want it to. So I usually just get the tip of it to come through, and then I go ahead and I pull it the rest of the way through with my pliers. And you can use little bits of the half round over here to kind of guide your wire so that you're holding it exactly where you want it to be as you go ahead and wrap it around a few more times around each bead to tie the pendant down tight and hold them where you want them sitting. And once I get down to where I have just a little bit of wire left, I go ahead and I actually am just going to pass it through and tie it directly to that wire between the beads. And I'll tighten it a couple times. Usually I wrap it about twice. Pull it down nice and tight, and then once I snip this guy off, it will actually pull the end of that wire and where I've tied it down inside of that bead because it's hollow. And so that's going to completely hide the end of that wire. And at that point, your whole pendant's put together. And the only thing you have to do now is just decide if you're okay with how your tourmaline is sitting. And mine is actually sitting really deep into the bottom prong over here and not really using this top prong much. So I'm just gonna go in here just a little bit and adjust the way it's sitting. See if I can't move it upward just a tiny bit to where I want it to be. And once I've gone ahead and adjusted the angle on that to where I'm happy with it because I feel like it's getting the benefit of all three prongs instead of only two of them, then I can go ahead and I can oxidize it. And I'm not sure how well the detail camera is working still. It's been giving me problems, but you should be able to see. And the light is also not doing great. Let me see if I can use this camera. Can you see it better from here? So you can see the similarities between the two. And each one of these ends up slightly different from each other just because of the way that they're made. And how you create the swirls and everything. They're never going to be identical, but you can catch a very similar look and feel for each one. And personally, I find that I prefer the depth and the look that you get once you've oxidized and polished, and you can kind of see the difference between the two here. This is something that I normally do in copper because in silver, I'm not a huge fan of deciding that I'm going to just grab a chunk of silver and hope it's the right length. But with copper, it's a little bit cheaper. I feel a little bit better doing stuff like this where I'm just like, about my forearm, that should work. So that's how I make those, and I do apologize for anybody who followed the first live stream and said that it was hard to see what was going on. And hopefully I can get everything fixed a little bit better so that you can see more what's going on as time continues and I do more of these.